Hi, my name is Xavier Solé. I am a visual artist and a senior lecturer and course leader at Kingston School of Art in London. My background I usually work with immersive technologies, and I explore these technologies to take a look at social commentary and how different exchange of social environments happen in those immersive spaces. I'm interested in topics such as the metaverse, Web3, and artificial intelligence, not only as a way to explore new ways of how society relates, but as well in new sustainable ways of working and learning. So now we're living in a very exciting time where a lot of technologies that have been evolving for quite a long time, they are merging and they are all coming up together. On the other hand, the boost in the technology and accessibility, not only on the headsets in the last 5 years, but as well in the applications that have been developed so far, not only in native, in immersive environments, but as well using Web3 as a way to decentralize those metaverses. I think that we are in a very, very exciting stage. In terms of how the Web3 presents a lot of challenges as well, which one of the most important challenges is how power intensive it is, and we are in a moment of climate emergency. So it's very important that energy efficient blockchains are being pushed forward. So technology is very interesting, but we need to be very responsible on how do we use it, and then what kind of blockchains are being used. So mainly the differences between the proof of work and proof of stake. Fantastic blockchains just like Ethereum that is opening a lot of possibilities for a lot of creators and is being developed with a lot of projects that are fantastic and really, really interesting. However, they are still very energy demanding. So that's something that Ethereum has said that wants to address very, very soon, but there is an urgency for that blockchain to develop in a proof of stake protocol. On the other hand, there's other blockchains such as Tezos, for example, that they are offering this kind of services, and there's a big community of very interesting artists that are developing their work on Tezos. It's just that they don't have the hype of Silicon Valley behind. So it could be good to help maybe not as fashionable blockchains, but that's they can be big players in the short and mid-term. The first part is the feeling of presence, of being surrounded in a place, and not just in VR, but in augmented reality as well, and mixed realities and so on. So there's a big step between having a conversation in 2D like we are having now, or a conversation in a 3D environment. The second aspect of it is the lack of limits. We are not tied to gravity. We are not tied to have to make a building that needs pillars and needs foundations and to hold all that weight of a building. So it opens the possibilities of creating and being able to be present in a space without the limits of the physical world. I think that good artwork is a storm of potential meaning. So an artwork creates a environment that allows a wiggle room, that allows some space for the audience to make their own minds in terms of what's going on. But in a way, what you do is to create that little world, that playground, that space, guiding and leaving some kind of clues that are not everything is open for interpretation. There's always an intention, but it's always the coding and decoding of certain ideas, of certain messages, feelings, and so on. We are seeing a lot of work not only created. So, for example, in virtual reality and immersive environments, we are seeing a lot of artworks that are exploring a lot of topics that are very relevant, as I was explaining before, in terms of identity, in terms of social relationships, and that's being explored in a very open way, and that's what I find very, very interesting. That this embodiment of the viewer and the possibility of explore to have agency as part of the audience to explore that world and that artwork, giving the chance of not just framing the point of view, but creating a space that you can discover for yourself. It's very interesting. I find very interesting as well how different disciplines kind of merge together, and how, for example, from the performance, from theater, from gaming, there's other disciplines that are being they are feeding these kind of new techniques of for creating artworks. Then there's the possibility as well of making it interactive and giving even more agency to the audience, to the viewer, to the user, to change the artwork. And that comes from the generative art as well, and all the digital art. So giving interaction to the piece and making the user, the viewer, part of the artwork itself. And that's related to performance art, to happenings, and this tradition of the second part of the 20th century in the art world. On the other hand, there is something very interesting in terms of creating digital art pieces in digital environments. One of the things I'm very interested in is that the creation of those, call it metaverses, call it omniverses, call it open verses, it can be a very good way for digital artists that their work is mainly, it's conceived, produced, and to be exhibited in the digital world. So I think that these constraints of having a 2D platform, which is a screen or a video or a website or this sort of platforms, they feel quite constrained for a lot of digital artists, that they can, particularly generative artists, that three-dimensional work should be explored more in depth. So it's interesting how this studio that is made in the metaverse or created in immersive environments, it can be a change on how creators and digital artists create work, how they relate with each other, and how they display the work. And that's all the studio practice that comes with it, that has been put in crisis for the last 50 years of what does the studio mean. And I think that this is, again, another iteration of how the people relate online, how the internet works, and then how the creators on digital work can produce and display work and relate to their audience and to other artists. Yeah, the Sun Followers is a VR piece where you are placed in the middle of a field of sunflowers, that they are three-dimensional. It's a field full of sunflowers, and you're placed in the middle of that field in the perspective of a point of view, in the first person perspective. What you look at is the aesthetics is almost like Matisse-like, as the cutout is 3D sunflowers made of cardboard that they have been cut out with a bit of a childish look. And then what happens is that those sunflowers, and then you see a big sun that is crossing the sky. So once the viewer starts looking around and panning, instead of the sunflowers following the sun, is the sun following you, which you realize that you're one of the sunflowers. That is an allegory of the relations of power between who is the follower, who is the one that is being followed, and what happens when you challenge the status quo, and when you don't follow who you are meant to follow, and then what happens when you don't follow what you're told to. I've been studying the Spanish Grandmaster Francisco Goya and he has portrayed, particularly in his series of etchings, he has portrayed a lot of different situations using the light and the darkness as a metaphor of rationality, and how the light, beats the darkness as a way of rational thinking and so on. So it's this tension between power and this thing of rationality and irrationality, all put together. It's a piece that lasts, it's 3 minutes or 2 minutes and 40 something, and it's quite shocking to see in such a short period, such a short amount of time, the narrative arch, that it has a beginning and it has an end, and in that short period of time, what I try to make feel is that different stages of realization. Who are you? What's going on? And what's the aftermath of what's going on? So I've always been interested in those platforms, and during the pandemic, I thought that it was a fantastic opportunity to test some of the ideas that I had in mind. We had a very big issue with engagement with the students, and I did a project called the Students VR Studios, where I asked the students to design their own studio, to be able to explore their own work displayed in their own studio. So that was something that was very successful in terms of and triggering a lot of questions in terms of how the creatives represent themselves into a 3D space when they have and no limits, when they have the possibilities to create their own space in a 3D environment, how they would represent themselves into avatars, and then how much of that feeling of presence is so embedded in those spaces. So instead of having Zoom calls with a massive grid of students without sharing their webcams and not being engaged, they were able to be embodied in different avatars, so they are not that exposed. And that definitely helped increasing the engagement of the students related to the activities that we were doing. That resulted as the engagement was much bigger. They felt they were in a space, so there was a lot of let's go there to talk about something, and that made a massive difference. They realized how important spatial sound is to create that feeling of presence, and even being in the same space but moving apart to have different conversations in different parts of the spaces. And that was something very beneficial for everyone. So they were feeling more part of a group, and more being in a place at the same time with their classmates. And in terms of the isolation and the slight anxiety and depression and mental health problems that everyone was having during the pandemic, of feeling very isolated, that helped overcome a little bit those problems. On the other hand, I did a second pilot test with a university in Barcelona, where with the collaboration of an academic in the University of Barcelona, Elisaba, we took Kingston School of Art students and Elisaba students, and then we created a bespoke virtual space so that they could collaborate in the virtual space remotely. And that was a very, very interesting experiment as well. So remote learning in arts education, in higher arts education, I think it's a big step to have a part of this education made in immersive environments, because art is social as well. You need that exchange of information. In Zoom calls, you miss some part of that information. It's not as good as being in person. I think that we cannot sell that the metaverse is as good as being in the flesh with someone. No. However, it's a much better way of having relationship with colleagues, with classmates, and having that feeling of presence, of exchanging, of feeling being part of the same space, much better than video calls, much better than other platforms that exist today. And then from a diversity and inclusion perspective and global perspective, it can allow a lot of people that, for example, it can declutter certain cities like London, like Shanghai, or like New York, or like Barcelona, or like big cities that, because of their attractive, become very expensive. And because they attract a lot of talent, they become very expensive. So this is a way of people who maybe cannot afford to live in London can have a much better experience learning creativity and working in the creative industries without all the money that involves living in those big cities. And possibly that allows people to live somewhere else, having that feeling of presence in their education, and then being able to progress without being so exclusive that just the people that can pay living in those places can afford to have that first quality education. So, and then last but not least, from an environmental point of view, there is a lot of meetings, there is a lot of travels, there is a lot of commuting that can be avoided, because having a meeting, taking a flight to do a meeting, that is not the same doing it in Zoom, but maybe you don't need to do it in person. It's a fantastic opportunity to cut a lot of the pollution that is created because of business or because of working. So that's something that, it's hybrid models. I'm not talking that everything has to be online, but we really, really need to reduce our emissions. Now is the perfect time to adopt new ways of working and new ways of learning.